There is a certain stillness that settles over the world on the coldest nights of winter, a hush so complete that even the wind seems to move more softly. In the medieval countryside, where cottages were small and the world outside was often unforgiving, this stillness was both familiar and deeply cherished. It was in these quiet hours, long before dawn, that the true rhythm of peasant life could be felt most clearly. Tonight, we return to that world, not to witness battles or feasts or the grand moments written into history books, but to visit the small, unseen rituals that kept ordinary people alive. How a family gathered around a fading hearth, sharing warmth the way others might share stories. How they layered wool and straw, not out of comfort but necessity. How the simple act of keeping a fire alive until morning became a skill passed down through generations. These were nights when the cold pressed against the walls like a living thing, and yet inside there was a quiet resilience, a soft determination, a kind of humble strength that rarely earns a place in heroic tales, but shaped the lives of millions. As we step into their world, let the pace slow. Let the crackle of a distant fire and the whisper of winter wind guide you. This is a story not of grand events, but of survival, simplicity, and the gentle rituals that carried medieval peasants through the harshest nights. Settle in. The night is cold, but their story is warm.
The year's end came quietly, without announcement. Only the dimming of the light, the way the sun hung low and red before sinking into the damp horizon. Across the northern countryside, peasants moved through the stubble fields one last time, gathering what the earth would still offer before it fell asleep. They bent low over the frozen ground, the smell of straw and soil heavy around them, hands rough from weeks of threshing. Grain that had been left too long was brittle now. It cracked between their fingers like thin glass. Men bound sheaves with cord made from last year's hemp. Women followed behind, collecting the loosened chaff. From distant hedgerows came the caw of hungry crows, circling black against a sky washed the color of pewter. The fields seemed endless and silent, except for the steady rhythm of work, the dull thud of a flail, the soft sigh of breath turning to mist. In the fading light, carts creaked toward the village. Children clung to the sides, sleepy and wrapped in scraps of wool. Dogs padded beside them, their coats spiked with frost. When they reached the gate, smoke from many hearths drifted above the thatch, and the faint smell of cooking filled the air. Winter was not yet at the door, but it could be felt. In the bones, in the stillness of the trees, in the way every sound seemed to echo just a little longer before fading. When the final harvest was brought in, attention turned inward. The villagers knew the pattern well. It had been passed from generation to generation with the same quiet precision as a prayer. Before the ground hardened, trenches were dug to drain water away from the cottages. Inside, cracks were stuffed with moss, straw, and mud. The smell of damp earth mixed with that of wood smoke. Firewood became a currency of its own. Men ventured into the thinning woods with axes dulled from years of use. The sound of chopping carried through the bare trees, rhythmic and patient. Logs were split, stacked in neat pyramids by the walls, covered with thatch to keep off the snow. Every family counted their store carefully. The winter would measure their success in warmth and hunger alike. Women busied themselves with the smaller labors of survival. Herbs hung from the beams, sage, thyme, and fennel, gathered months earlier. Dried beans rattled in clay jars. Strips of salted pork gleamed faintly with fat in the dim light. The spinning wheel murmured in the corner, its slow turning as steady as breath. Outside, geese were plucked, feathers saved for bedding. There was comfort in this repetition. The peasants spoke little. Their movements said enough. Each gesture, the tying of twine, the sealing of a jar, was a thread in the tapestry of endurance that held the community together when the nights grew endless. One morning, the world changed overnight. The villagers awoke to a silence so complete that even the dogs hesitated before barking. Frost had come. Every blade of grass glittered beneath a thin silver crust. The pond beside the mill wore a sheet of glass so perfect that the reflection of the church spire seemed carved into it. Children ran outside barefoot, squealing at the cold until their mothers called them back. The men tested the air. It bit the lungs with the sharpness of iron. The women watched their breath rise like incense as they hung laundry that would never truly dry again. By noon, the frost had turned to hoarfrost, thicker, whiter, and crueler. The fields shimmered like powdered glass. Work slowed. Tools froze to handles. Water stiffened in buckets. The livestock were brought closer to the cottages, huddled for warmth. Smoke rose from every roof now, staining the pale sky with soft gray ribbons. For a moment, before dusk settled, the world seemed suspended, caught between seasons, between motion and stillness. In that fragile balance, life felt both eternal and fleeting. The endless turning of the year, the fragile warmth of human breath against the immensity of cold. As December deepened, the days shortened, until light itself felt like a memory. The sun rose late and set early, a dull orange coin vanishing behind gray clouds. Inside the cottages, people learned to measure time by the rhythm of the fire, its morning spark, its afternoon blaze, its slow dying at night. Winter was not simply a season. It was a teacher. It asked for patience, for stillness. Fields once busy with movement now lay silent beneath their shroud of snow. Roads disappeared. Streams froze solid, and the familiar landscape turned strange. The peasant's world contracted to a few warm feet around the hearth. In those months, emotions deepened like the snowdrifts outside. Laughter, when it came, seemed brighter. Sorrow, heavier. The isolation of winter bred a kind of quiet reflection. Some spoke of saints and miracles, others of omens seen in the fire's smoke. Most said little. The language of survival was silence. The unspoken bond between neighbors who lent each other firewood, who shared bread without counting the cost. Yet beneath the heaviness there was beauty. The night skies stretched endlessly clear, stars burning cold and close. The snow glittered under moonlight like powdered crystal. In those small hours, wrapped in furs and half dreaming by the embers, the villagers felt something close to peace. A fragile peace, born not of comfort, but of acceptance. When they spoke of this time in later months, they did not call it hardship. They called it the long winter, as if naming a companion who had once stayed too long by the fire, leaving behind both memory and warmth. In the quiet stillness of the medieval countryside, the peasant's cottage rose not as a monument to human ambition, but as a modest expression of endurance. It was small, often no larger than a modern room, yet within its rough walls the whole of life unfolded. Built by the same hands that would harvest and sow, its bones were simple, a frame of timber set deep into the earth. Between those timbers, woven branches plastered with mud, straw, and animal dung. Wattle and daub. The phrase still carries the rhythm of its making. There was no symmetry, no perfect line, only the language of survival, spoken through each uneven beam. The roof bent low, thatched with reeds from the nearby marshes. When the wind moved across it, the whole house seemed to whisper. Inside, a single room, sometimes two, held everything the family possessed. Floor of packed dirt, a hearth of stones, a wooden chest against the wall where the family's few clothes and treasures lay folded. The air smelled of smoke, clay, and human breath. In daylight, light crept through the doorway in slanting lines, turning the dust to gold. By night, firelight filled the gaps, painting soft shadows on the rough walls. Smoke hung thick, drifting upward through the thatch. There was no chimney. The whole roof served as one. Just estate children grew up in that haze, their lungs toughened by it. To them, smoke meant warmth and life. When storms came, the wind pressed through every crack. The house trembled like an old man, but it stood. Each winter, repairs were made. A new beam, a new layer of thatch. The same materials from the same earth put back into place by the same hands. The cottage was a living thing. It decayed, it healed, it continued. In a world without permanence, this was enough. Every medieval home, no matter how small, revolved around a single steady thing: the fire. It was the first to wake in the morning and the last to rest at night. Its ashes were never allowed to die completely, always kept smoldering under layers of charcoal and straw, so that the family could coax it to life again at dawn. Matches did not exist. Relighting from nothing could take hours. To lose the fire was to lose warmth, food, and comfort all at once. Some households even borrowed flame from their neighbors when their own hearth went cold, carrying it carefully in covered pots, like a sacred gift. The hearth was built at the center of the room, a low ring of stones blackened by years of use. There was no chimney. Smoke drifted upward through the rafters and out through the thatch, staining the beams dark as pitch. Over time, the soot hardened, sealing the roof from rain, a kind of natural armor made from decades of burning. Around the fire, life unfolded in slow rhythm. The mother stirred the pot, a simple stew of barley, cabbage, and whatever meat could be spared. The children huddled close, tracing shapes in the dirt with bits of straw. The father mended tools in the flicker of light, his hands coarse from fieldwork. Conversation was quiet, almost murmured, as though to speak too loudly might disturb the fragile peace the fire provided. In winter, the flames threw long shadows up the walls. Sometimes, when the wind moaned outside, the shadows seemed to move on their own, swaying gently like figures dancing in silence. The people of the village were not immune to superstition. They spoke of spirits, of ancestors drawn to warmth. And perhaps, in the half-light, one could almost believe they lingered. The fire also served as a clock. The length of a burning log marked the passing of hours. The dimming glow signaled when it was time to sleep. There were no bells, no candles for every room, only this: the ancient rhythm of flame and ember, the soft crackle that measured the night. And when morning came, the first light touched the smoke that still lingered, turning it pale gold. The hearth smoldered quietly, like a heartbeat beneath the house. To step inside a peasant's home was to enter a world stripped bare of excess. Nothing here was wasted, and every object told a story. A single wooden table dominated the center of the room, uneven, handmade, its surface scarred by knives and years of meals. Around it, three-legged stools carved from oak or ash, a rough bench for the children, its legs mended again and again with new pegs. Beside the wall, a chest, the most important possession of all. It held everything of value: the Sunday tunic, the spare wool blanket, the family's few coins, and perhaps a small prayer book, its pages smudged from handling. The walls themselves were storage. Hooks carved into the timbers held tools, sickles, spades, small hammers, a wooden ladle. The ceiling beams were lined with hanging herbs, onions, and garlic, drying slowly in the smoke. A single iron pot hung over the fire, the heart of every meal. There was no abundance, yet there was order. Each thing had its place and its purpose. Near the door, a rough shelf held everyday miracles of survival. Flint and steel for fire starting, a horn cup for ale, and a crude candle made from tallow. The light it gave was dim, but precious. When the wind blew through the cracks, the flames swayed and guttered, painting the room in slow-moving amber waves. In one corner, a cradle carved from spare wood rocked gently. The bedding inside was straw, softened with worn linen. The baby slept to the rhythm of the fire's crackle and the murmur of voices. Across the room, the parents' bed was only a raised platform of planks, piled with straw and covered by wool. Sometimes the whole family slept there together, not from affection, but warmth. The peasant's world was made of few things, but those things endured. Every tool, every pot, every stitch of cloth was mended until mending was no longer possible. When something finally broke beyond repair, its parts were reused elsewhere. A broken bowl became a scoop. A cracked plank became kindling. Poverty demanded not despair, but creativity. And within that constraint, there was a strange kind of peace. Outside, the seasons ruled every hour. But inside the peasant's home, life followed a rhythm quieter and more constant, the pulse of daily repetition. At dawn, the fire was stirred. Smoke drifted through the thatch as the first light touched the walls. Bread dough, prepared the night before, was baked on the hearthstone, thick, coarse loaves that would feed the family through the day. The smell of grain and smoke filled the room. The mother hummed softly as she worked, her song half prayer, half memory. The father gathered his tools and stepped into the gray morning, his boots sinking into the frost. The children stirred behind him, their faces still marked by the straw they had slept upon. When the door closed, silence returned, the kind of silence that hums softly beneath every human dwelling. Throughout the day, the home waited. Chickens clucked near the doorway, scratching at the dirt. The wind pressed against the walls, sometimes moaning, sometimes whispering. Inside, the mother spun wool by the fire, her fingers steady, her eyes half closed in thought. Time here did not rush. It drifted like smoke. By evening, the cottage came alive again. The father returned, his hands numb, his breath clouding the air. The fire was fed, the pot refilled, the family gathered once more. Conversation was small, but steady. Talk of fields, weather, and small hopes for tomorrow. There were no grand ambitions, no faraway dreams, only the quiet satisfaction of having endured another day. Sometimes the neighbors would visit. They would bring news, or bread, or simply company. Laughter echoed softly in the smoky air. Children fell asleep beside the hearth, their faces turned to the glow. The world outside was dark and uncertain, but in that room there was light, thin, fragile, but real. As night deepened, the fire was banked again. Ashes covered the coals, keeping their warmth alive. The family lay down together, wrapped in the sounds of the house, the creak of beams, the wind in the roof, the slow breathing of those they loved. Beyond the door, the village slept under a cold sky. But in each small cottage, a faint ember glowed, a pulse of life against the dark. To us, these cottages might seem crude, dark, smoky, confined. Yet to those who lived there, they were enough. They were the anchor in a world of hardship, the small circle of warmth where children were born, where stories were told, and where generations endured. Every line of their construction spoke of balance between nature and labor, between fragility and resilience. The peasants did not own the land beneath their feet, but they built upon it as though it were part of their own flesh. The walls were mud and straw, yet they held within them the essence of 1,000 quiet evenings. In that simplicity, there was a kind of grace, the kind that does not shout or shine, but lingers, soft and patient, like the smoke that never quite leaves the rafters. And so, when we think of the Middle Ages, of knights and kings and wars, we might also think of this: a small house by the edge of a field, its thatched roof bowed with time, a thin thread of smoke rising into the gray winter sky. Inside, a family sleeps beside their fire, dreaming, breathing, waiting for dawn. Before the light touched the frost of morning, the peasant's first task was always the same: to make bread. Not the soft white loaves of the wealthy, but coarse, heavy rounds of barley and rye, dark in color, rough in texture, and strong enough to last through days of work. The dough was mixed slowly, by hand. A wooden bowl held the meal, water, and salt, kneaded until it no longer stuck to the fingers. Yeast was a luxury few could afford. Instead, the dough rested near the hearth overnight, warmed by the dying coals, rising gently by the grace of time and air. In the morning, the woman of the house would flatten it with her palms, mark it with a cross, not merely for faith, but as a small wish that it would bake well, and slide it onto a heated stone or into the ashes themselves. When the smell filled the cottage, even the youngest stirred from sleep. It was the smell of survival, of another day granted. The bread came out blackened on the edges, cracked on the top, and dense enough to keep hunger at bay through long hours in the field. Sometimes, when flour was scarce, crushed peas or acorns were added to stretch the supply. The taste was bitter, but no one complained. Each family baked as much as they could afford. On good days, there was enough to trade a loaf for salt or oil. On bad days, the bread was thin and dry, shared in silence. There was no waste. Even the hard crusts found new life as crumbs in broth. In every home, the small ritual repeated: kneading, waiting, baking, blessing. The bread was both food and calendar, each loaf a marker of time passing, of the cycle between hunger and plenty, of seasons changing outside. When the family sat at the table, the father broke the loaf in half. The sound, that rough, dry crack, was the first word spoken each morning. The center of every meal was the pot that hung above the fire, blackened, heavy, its handle worn smooth by years of hands. It was rarely empty. Into it went whatever the season or fortune allowed: barley, beans, bits of cabbage, a bone if luck was kind. The peasant's stew was a living thing, constantly fed and stirred, its taste changing from day to day, from hour to hour. Water came from the well, a handful of salt, if there was any, carrots and turnips, softened by long boiling, sometimes a bit of smoked pork, or a scrap from a feast at the manor, traded for labor. On special occasions, weddings, births, or holy days, the pot might see real meat, chicken perhaps, a piece of venison, if the Lord had turned a blind eye to poaching. The smell of the stew filled the house thick and comforting. Even when hunger was constant, this scent made the air feel generous. Steam rose into the rafters, carrying the taste of earth and fire. Children gathered around the hearth, watching as the spoon moved slowly through the broth, their eyes following the swirl as though it were magic. Meals were taken together in quiet reverence, a shared bowl, wooden spoons passed from hand to hand. No one ate until the head of the house had blessed the food. "For what we have," he would murmur, "we are grateful." It was not a grand prayer, just a whisper into the steam, half lost to the fire's crackle. The stew never truly ended. Each day new ingredients joined what was left of the last. A piece of bread torn into it thickened the broth. A few drops of ale gave it flavor. It was both meal and memory, a record of days gone by, of what the land had offered and what it had withheld. The peasants could not choose their meals, but they could choose how to honor them, and in that choice lay a quiet dignity. When winter deepened, the pot grew thin. The vegetables were gone, the last of the grain counted carefully. What remained was little dried peas, old bread, the brittle rind of last year's cheese. The hearth still burned, but the stew no longer sang. It whispered now, quietly, with little left to give. In those months, hunger lived beside them. It crept into every task, every breath. The peasants learned to stretch their food the way they stretched their hope thin, but enough to survive another day. A spoonful of meal mixed with water became porridge. Weeds gathered from the frozen edge of the fields became soup. The bark of young trees could be ground into powder, added to flour. They called it famine bread. It filled the stomach, though it offered no comfort. The body changed with the season. Faces grew hollow, eyes dulled. Yet life continued in slow rhythm. The fire was never allowed to die, for its warmth was the last defense. Around it, people huddled, speaking little, moving less. Sometimes, when the hunger grew too sharp, they would speak of summer, of fields full of grain and the hum of bees. The mind found warmth where the body could not. Children were taught not to cry for more. They learned early that life was a cycle of feast and want. The mothers whispered stories instead, to fill the space where food should have been. Tales of saints who shared bread with the poor, of miracles born from faith and patience. In that darkness, belief was sustenance. And yet, even in hardship, there were moments of quiet grace. When snow fell softly outside, the firelight painted gold halos on the walls. The cottage felt smaller, but closer. The hunger, though constant, became a shared burden, one that bound the family together in a silence more tender than speech. Spring always returned. The first shoots of green along the road, the first fat fish in the stream, small signs that the world had not forgotten them. And when the pot bubbled again with new herbs, new life, they would give thanks, not in song or feast, but in a long exhale of relief. When the year turned and the harvest was gathered, the peasants' tables changed. For a few brief weeks, hunger loosened its grip. Grain sacks filled the corner of the cottage. Baskets of apples, onions, and cabbages lined the floor. Ale brewed fresh in the barrels, sweet and strong. Smoke from roasting meat drifted through the village, a scent so rare that even the old lifted their heads to breathe it in. Feasts were not daily things. They were moments of release, of joy carved from exhaustion. On such nights, the hearth became an altar. The stew pot overflowed with meat and herbs. Bread was baked thick and round, brushed with honey if it could be spared. Neighbors gathered under the thatched roof, bringing what they could, a jug of ale, a handful of eggs, a song. The cottage glowed, candles flickered. Faces, once drawn by hunger, now shone with laughter. Children played at the door, their bare feet tracing the same earth their ancestors had known. For one night, the world outside the cold, the fields, the weight of labor disappeared. Only warmth remained, rising from the hearth like a blessing. Music sometimes filled the room, a flute, a drum, the rhythm of hands on wood. The songs were simple, but they carried the echo of generations. They spoke of fields and rivers, of love and loss, of the sun that would return. The fire answered with its own voice, crackling, steady, eternal. In the quiet that followed the feast, when only embers glowed and the night had deepened, the family sat in silence. It was in these rare pauses that the meaning of their struggle revealed itself. The fire, the food, the labor, the endless repetition, it was not for glory nor wealth, but for this, a single shared moment of peace beneath a humble roof. The medieval peasant's table was not grand, but it was sacred. It held not abundance, but gratitude, and in that gratitude lay the quiet beauty of their existence, fragile, flickering, yet unbroken. When the night drew long and the embers dimmed, the peasant's hearth never truly went dark. A single coal was always kept alive, buried beneath ash, glowing faintly, a promise of tomorrow. In the endless cycle of hunger and plenty, of winter and spring, the hearth remained constant. It was the center of life, of memory, of faith. Every story began and ended there, every birth, every death, every whispered prayer. The food they ate was humble, the fire they tended was small, but together they sustained something far greater than warmth or nourishment. They sustained hope. And when dawn came again, pale and cold, the first thing to rise would be the smoke, thin, silver, curling upward from the thatched roofs of the sleeping village, the quiet breath of a world that refused to fade. In the medieval world, clothing was not a matter of fashion, but of endurance. Each thread was a shield, each layer a quiet act of defiance against cold, damp, and time itself. For the peasant, warmth was both armor and burden. The day began with wool, coarse, heavy, and imperfect. It scratched the skin, but the body learned not to mind. Beneath it, if fortune allowed, a tunic of linen, woven from flax grown by the very hands that would wear it. Linen was cool in summer, soft after many washings, and precious enough to be mended until only patches remained. Above all, it was clean, the one luxury a poor man could maintain. The tunic fell to the knees, belted at the waist by a cord of hemp. Over it came another layer, a cloak or a hood, dyed brown or gray with plant roots and ash. No bright colors here, only the hues of earth and smoke. The dyeing process itself was a patient art, a pot simmering with nettles, walnut husks, or onion skins, the fabric stirring slowly as if in meditation. Footwear was simple too, strips of leather wrapped around the feet, tied with cords. In the depths of winter, they stuffed straw inside for warmth. Gloves were rare. Instead, calloused skin bore the season's weight without complaint. Children often went barefoot until frostbite warned them otherwise. Nothing was wasted. When garments tore, they were mended. When they could no longer be mended, they were cut into strips and turned into padding or rags. And when even those were gone, the scraps became kindling for the morning fire. The life of a garment mirrored the life of its owner, long, difficult, and circular. To see a peasant walking through the snow was to see an image of persistence. Layers upon layers, color of dust and ash, moving through the frozen world like part of the earth itself. Before a single thread touched the loom, there was work. Long, patient, endless work. Clothing began in the fields, under the same sky that watched over the harvests. Sheep grazed on distant hillsides, their wool thick and tangled. Each spring they were shorn by hand, metal shears snipping rhythmically, the sound sharp and steady. The fleece was heavy with dirt and lanolin, smelling of grass and life. It was washed in cold streams, beaten and left to dry in the sun. Women and girls gathered around the piles, teasing the fibers apart with combs, spinning them into thread on simple spindles. The hum of spinning wheels was a song of the village, a quiet chorus rising from every doorway. The movement was hypnotic, steady as breath. Twist, draw, wind. Twist, draw, wind. Through this repetition, warmth was born. Once the thread was made, the weaving began. A loom was a treasure passed from mother to daughter. Its wooden frame creaked with every motion, echoing softly in the dim interior. The shuttle darted back and forth, carrying the weft across the warp. Each strike of the beater tightened the fabric, sealing time into the weave. When the cloth was finished, it was thick, rough, and alive with imperfections, the mark of human hands, of patience, of care. It would be cut carefully with a small knife, shaped into tunics, cloaks, and hose. No two were ever alike. Some were bound with a simple cord, others fastened with wooden pins or bits of bone. Stitch by stitch, the garments took on the warmth of their maker. Clothing was not merely worn, it was lived in, repaired, reborn. Each patch carried the memory of another season survived. To hold such cloth was to hold time itself, soft and heavy in the palm. When winter settled across the land, it did not ask permission. It crept through the gaps in the walls, through the cracks beneath the door, and over the sleeping forms beneath thin blankets of wool. No fire could ever keep it entirely out. The peasants fought it not with strength, but with layers, with habit, and with quiet endurance. At night, families slept close, pressed together beneath cloaks and blankets. The air inside the cottage was smoky, the walls damp with frost. Breath rose in clouds. In the corner, shoes stiffened with ice. But under the shared weight of fabric and flesh, there was warmth. A small, stubborn warmth, that belonged to no one else. In the darkest months, clothing became both shield and second skin. The outer cloak was rarely removed, even indoors. The wool absorbed the scent of smoke, of earth, of work, until it became indistinguishable from the life of its wearer. The same cloak that kept a man dry in the fields became his blanket at night, his shroud when he died. The poor could not afford new garments, but they learned how to make the old ones last. Holes were patched with strips of different cloth, elbows reinforced with scraps of leather. A peasant's clothing was a map of his life. Every tear a mark of labor, every repair a trace of care. Sometimes travelers would pass through the village, monks, peddlers, beggars. Their robes patched even more than the peasants. Yet they shared something sacred, the understanding that warmth was a holy thing. Fire, cloth, and flesh, the trinity that kept humanity alive in the age of cold. When the wind howled and the snow buried the path, people stayed close to their hearths. They rubbed their hands together, warmed them on the pot lid, wrapped themselves in every scrap of wool they owned. Outside, the world froze in silence. Inside, hearts beat quietly, wrapped in smoke and patience. Not all garments were equal. In the medieval world, fabric spoke a language understood by all, one that marked class, labor, and faith. The peasant wore wool because it was all the land could offer. The lord wore linen and fur. Yet both, in their own ways, sought the same comfort, the same small protection against the cold hand of the world. A peasant's cloak might be fastened with a wooden pin, while the lord's was clasped with silver. But the gesture, the drawing of the cloth across the shoulders, the pulling of the hood over the head, was universal. In that shared motion lay the quiet truth of their humanity. For the poor, clothing held meaning beyond its use. A mother might pass her apron to her daughter on her wedding day. A father might leave his woolen hood to his eldest son. Each piece carried memory, labor, and the invisible thread of lineage. To inherit clothing was to inherit the endurance of one's kin. There were also garments of faith, the rough habit of a monk, the veil of a nun, the white linen shroud of the dead. These, too, reminded people that cloth could protect not only the body, but the spirit. In a world ruled by the seasons, warmth became a metaphor for grace. Even the simplest tunic, patched and smoke-stained, was a miracle of hands, patience, and time. Every stitch represented an hour of labor stolen from the day's exhaustion. Every thread held the promise of shelter. To make such a garment was to shape hope itself, not bright, but enduring, like an ember that refuses to die. And so the peasants wore their lives upon their skin, the weight of their days woven into every fold and seam. When they walked through the fields in the pale light of dawn, their cloaks moving in the wind, they looked not poor, but eternal. Clothing in the medieval world was more than necessity. It was memory made visible. Each garment carried the scent of smoke, the touch of hands long gone. The endurance of countless winters survived. There were no wardrobes filled with choices, no idle mirrors, only the slow, deliberate act of dressing, of preparing to meet the day's cold with whatever the earth had offered. And in that act, there was dignity. Wool and linen, leather and straw, these humble materials became symbols of perseverance. They bore the weight of humanity's oldest struggle. to stay warm, to stay alive, to stay kind. When we imagine those distant centuries, we may think first of castles and kings, but somewhere in the shadow of those walls, a peasant bends to mend a cloak by firelight, his fingers stiff, his breath fogging the air. Outside, the night wind sighs. Inside, a thread passes through cloth, slow and steady, a heartbeat echoing through time.
Before the bell in the chapel called the morning prayer, the land was already awake. Faint gray stretched across the horizon, revealing the soft roll of the fields and the mist that lingered like a veil. A rooster's cry drifted from a distant yard, and one by one, cottage doors creaked open. The peasants stepped into the half-light, wrapped in wool and breath. Tools hung from their shoulders, wooden rakes, flails, mattocks, and scythes. The soil underfoot was still hard from the frost, but they knew that once the sun touched it, the earth would yield. They walked in silence toward the fields, their feet following paths trodden by generations before them. The rhythm of the day began not with words, but with movement, steady, ritualized. Each person had a task already written in the turning of the seasons. The men worked the furrows. The women gathered kindling or milked the cows. Children carried water from the stream. To live here was to obey a calendar older than parchment.
When the first rays broke, they glimmered across the plowshares, crude iron gleaming faintly beneath layers of soil. The oxen snorted clouds of white breath as they strained against their yokes. The farmer guided them with soft words, patient and low, his boots sinking into the thawing ground. The scent of damp soil rose like incense. Above, crows drifted lazily, black shapes against the pale sky. The day had begun, and it would not end until the light itself died. By mid-morning, the village hummed with the sound of labor. The plow cut deep, turning the earth in slow, heavy lines. Each furrow was a promise, a memory of past harvests and the hope of another to come. The oxen trudged forward, their muscles glistening beneath matted hair. Behind them walked the plowman, his hands blistered yet steady on the wooden handles. The iron blade groaned as it met stones hidden beneath the soil, but he did not falter. This was his dialogue with the land, a language of sweat and endurance. Further across the field, a group of women bent to sow seed by hand. The gesture was timeless, a swing of the arm, a scatter of grain, a pause, a breath. Each motion was measured to the rhythm of their steps, each handful of seed falling like small prayers. They moved in lines, faces half hidden beneath woolen veils, their skirts brushing against the stubble left from last year's harvest. The sun rose higher, glinting on beads of sweat. Lunch was a crust of bread, dipped in ale or cold water, eaten sitting on a stone wall. Conversation was sparse. The sound of wind in the hedgerows filled the spaces where words might have been. As the day wore on, the soil darkened with moisture, rich and fragrant. When the final furrow was drawn, the plowman leaned on his handle, gazing at the long stripes of turned land stretching into the mist. It was not beauty he saw, but survival. Each mark was a heartbeat in the long body of the year. In the medieval world, every season demanded its due. Spring belonged to planting, summer to growth, autumn to the harvest, and winter to mending, sharpening, and waiting. Spring began in mud and prayer. The soil was heavy, the air sharp, but the people were alive with purpose.
They sowed oats and barley first, then wheat and rye. The fields became patchworks of green shoots trembling in the wind. Summer was the season of vigilance. Too much rain or too little could undo months of toil. Weeds were pulled, pests driven off, ditches cleared for water to flow. The sun burned the skin dark, clothing clung damp with sweat. At midday, some would rest beneath trees, drinking weak ale brewed to be safer than the well water. Yet even rest felt temporary. The earth always called them back. Autumn was both mercy and trial. The reaping began at dawn. Men swung scythes in long arcs, cutting the golden grain that swayed like the sea. Behind them came women with sickles, binding the stalks into sheaves and stacking them in rows to dry. Children gathered stray ears, filling their aprons with what the wind had scattered. Every hand, however small, had its task. At dusk, carts creaked homeward, heavy with wheat. The smell of straw filled the air, and the fields lay bare, the stubble glowing faintly in the fading light. Songs rose softly, worn with fatigue, yet threaded with gratitude. The harvest was life, and it had been spared another year. Then came winter, the silence after the storm of labor. The ground froze, the tools rested in corners. Men repaired handles and sharpened blades. Women spun wool by the hearth. Outside, snow smoothed the furrows into quiet white hills. Yet even in stillness, the fields slept only lightly, waiting for the thaw to wake them once more. The peasants' hands told stories that no parchment recorded. Thick-fingered and scarred, they bore the memory of every furrow, every harvest. Under their nails lived the color of the earth itself. Labor was not simply toil, it was communion. To touch the soil each day was to share breath with it. The people knew their land intimately, where the water pooled, where the shade lingered longest, where the grain grew tall or stunted. They spoke of fields by name as if of neighbors. When famine came, as it sometimes did, the same hands gathered nettles and acorns, ground them with bark to make bitter bread. In good years, they held the smooth weight of ripe apples and plums, or braided garlands of straw for the harvest feast. To an outsider, the work might have seemed endless, joyless even. But among those who lived it, there was a quiet pride. The rhythm of plow and sow, reap and rest, gave their lives a shape the centuries could not erase. They worked for lords and tithes and kings, yes, but also for the small piece of earth that bore their names in silence. When a peasant died, his neighbors said simply, "He has gone back to the field." The phrase was not poetic, it was literal. The soil received them as it had received the seed. In this way, the land kept its people close, forever returning what it was given. As the sun slipped behind the woods, the day exhaled. Tools were gathered, oxen unyoked and led home. The last light clung to the stubble fields, turning each straw tip to gold. The peasants walked slowly back along the path, clothes darkened by sweat and dust. The village roofs smoked ahead of them, thin, comforting lines against the reddening sky. Bells tolled faintly from the church tower, calling voices murmured the prayer, while feet kept their steady pace. At home, boots were left by the door, cloaks hung by the fire. Bread and porridge filled the air with a scent of warmth. Children dozed on benches, while adults ate in silence, listening to the wind outside. There was no talk of rest, only of tomorrow and the next sowing and the weather that might come. When at last the fire sank low, the fields beyond the window disappeared into darkness. Yet in the peasants' minds they were still there, vast and breathing beneath the stars. The work never truly ended. It only slept as they did. Centuries later, the furrows have long since softened. The cottages have crumbled. The plows rusted to dust. Yet the shape of those fields remains. Faint lines visible from the sky, the memory of toil written into the land itself. The peasants who walked them are gone, but their rhythm endures. The same wind crosses those plains, the same rain darkens the soil, and somewhere, beneath it all, the bones of those who once worked there rest like seed, hidden but not forgotten. Their lives were measured not in years but in harvests. They left no monuments, only bread and warmth and the turning of the earth. Theirs was the oldest story, not of kings or wars, but of the patient bond between hand and soil. And when the long winter comes again, as it always will, the land will remember them, the ones who kept it alive. Every village in the medieval world had a heart, and that heart was made of stone. It stood at the center, small and solemn, surrounded by cottages and fields. The church, not grand like the cathedrals of cities, but humble, built by the same hands that tilled the soil and shaped the bread. The walls were rough and uneven, laid from river stones and lime. Moss clung to their cracks, and ivy climbed toward the small arched windows of stained glass that caught the morning sun in quiet colors. The roof sagged slightly, patched with timber and thatch, yet it stood faithful and unmoving through every season's cruelty. Each Sunday the people came, boots caked in mud, cloaks heavy with dew. They walked the same worn path to its door. Children ran ahead, their laughter echoing faintly off the stones, while older men leaned on staffs, heads bowed. They came not from piety alone, but because the church was the center of time. Its bell marked their days. Its walls held their beginnings and ends. Inside it smelled of wax and cold air. The wooden pews creaked beneath the weight of generations. Candles flickered on the altar, their small flames dancing before carved saints who gazed down in eternal silence. The priest, often a man of the village himself, spoke slowly, his Latin softened by the local tongue. Few understood the words, but all understood the tone, steady, soothing, ancient. Here, for a brief hour, the burdens of the week grew lighter. The world outside, with its mud, its hunger, its endless labor, seemed to rest beyond the stone threshold. The sound of the bell still lingered in the air, carrying the message that time, though harsh, was also sacred. Long before sunrise, the bell spoke. Its tone rolled through the valley, deep and slow, waking the crows from the trees and the peasants from their straw beds. The sound was not sharp, but round, a sound that seemed to carry both sorrow and grace in its echo. It called the faithful to morning prayer. It marked the passing of the hours, the seasons, the years. It told for birth, for marriage, for death. To live beneath its sound was to live beneath the breath of time itself. The bell was not just an instrument of metal. It was a living voice, heavy, resonant, and patient. Its body was cast in fire by craftsmen far away, inscribed with blessings, and lifted high into the church's wooden tower by ropes and prayer. Once raised, it became the voice of the community. Children learned to know its moods. A slow, steady toll meant a funeral. Quick chimes, a feast or holy day. When danger approached, a storm, a fire, a raid, it rang in frantic rhythm, and the entire valley listened. In peace, it marked the hours of work and rest, a gentle reminder that life moved in circles, not lines. Even those who worked far in the fields could hear it. They would pause, wipe sweat from their brows, and bow their heads briefly toward the sound. The bell connected them, the living and the dead, the plow and the prayer, the soil and the soul. When evening came, its final note drifted over the thatched roofs like a benediction. For a moment, everything was still. Even the wind seemed to listen. Faith in the medieval village was not grand or adorned with ceremony. It was woven quietly into the pattern of each day. It lived in gestures, a sign of the cross before work, a murmured blessing over bread, a candle lit for the souls of the departed. The peasants did not question their faith, they breathed it. Their prayers were not lofty petitions, but small conversations whispered to the sky. When the harvest failed, they prayed for strength. When the rain came, they gave thanks. In every hardship, there was a sense that the world was still watched over, even if from far away. Inside the church, men and women knelt side by side, rough hands clasped in silence. The flickering light of candles painted their faces gold. The priest's voice echoed gently, speaking of patience, humility, and hope. Some understood the words, others only felt the rhythm, the cadence of comfort. Children fidgeted, tracing patterns in the dust on the floor. The old dozed lightly, their heads bowed as if listening to something only they could hear. And when the final hymn rose, soft, untrained voices trembling on simple notes, it carried the sound of humanity itself. For many, this small church was the only place in their lives that offered beauty untouched by labor. It was where the harshness of existence gave way, if only for a moment, to something gentler, a reminder that even among mud and hunger, the soul could find peace. The church watched over every milestone of the peasant's life. It was here that infants were baptized, newlyweds blessed, and the dead laid to rest. Its bell tolled for each, the same voice for joy and sorrow alike. When a child was born, its first cry mingled with the ringing of the morning bell. The priest would pour cool water over its forehead, mark it with oil, and speak words that tied its small soul to heaven. The mother stood beside him, tired but radiant, the weight of hope heavy in her arms. Outside, neighbors waited to share bread and congratulations, life continuing unbroken. For weddings, the whole village came. Cloaks were brushed, shoes cleaned, ribbons tied, the air filled with laughter, the smell of bread and ale. Yet even in joy there was humility. The vows were simple, the blessings quiet. When the couple left the church, they stepped back into the same muddy world, but together, bound not just by love, but by endurance. And when death came, as it always did, the bell rang low and solemn. The body was brought into the church one last time, wrapped in linen, laid before the altar. Candles burned around it, while prayers were murmured in the hush. Then it was carried to the churchyard, where the ground was soft and familiar. The same hands that had sown seeds now lowered their neighbor into the soil. The priest said, "From earth you came, to earth you return." And the people understood those words more deeply than any scripture. The priest of the village was both servant and shepherd. He lived simply in a small house beside the church, his walls lined with books and tools. He rose with the bell, tended his small garden, and walked the fields to bless them before the sowing. His days were measured not in sermons, but in footsteps across the parish. He knew every family, every grief. He baptized their children, buried their dead, heard their confessions whispered in fear or fatigue. Sometimes he carried bread to widows, or read aloud by the fire to those who could not see. His robe was patched, his sandals worn thin, but the people respected him, not as a man above them, but as one among them. In winter he lit extra candles to keep the church warm. In summer he left the doors open so the wind could wander through the nave. During harvest he prayed for fair weather, and when storms broke the crops, he prayed for courage instead. His life, like theirs, moved in quiet cycles, and when the day ended, he would stand alone in the doorway of the church, watching the sky fade from gold to gray. The bell above him hung silent, its great shape dark against the dusk. In that silence, he would smile, because he knew that the sound would rise again tomorrow, and the people would come. As night fell, the final toll echoed across the sleeping village. It was the sound of completion of another day, surrendered to the long rhythm of existence. Cottage fires dimmed one by one. Smoke drifted upward, mixing with the fog. The roads emptied. Even the dogs grew quiet. In the churchyard, frost began to gather on the stones, and the bell's echo hung over the roofs like a memory. Inside, the priest snuffed the candles. The altar faded into shadow. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of the breath of prayers, of footsteps worn into the floor, of lives spent and remembered. Outside, the moon lifted over the fields, silvering the world. The bell, now still, caught the faint light on its curved bronze surface, like a sleeping heart. The church stood unmoving in the center of it all, patient, enduring, eternal. And in the cottages nearby, men and women drifted into sleep, comforted by the knowledge that when dawn came, time in its endless circle would begin once more. Centuries pass, the stones crumble, the bells fall silent, and the voices of the village fade into the soil. But if one walks through the ruins on a quiet morning, sometimes the air still seems to hum, faintly, like a bell ringing from far away. It is not imagination, it is memory. The sound of hands folded in prayer, of footsteps on stone, of breath turning to song. The echo of all who lived by that rhythm, who found in its chime a measure of peace. The church remains, even when unseen, not in stone, but in the pattern of days that follow, in the stillness between one heartbeat and the next. The bell, too, endures, not as sound, but as silence waiting to be heard. And so, the voice of the village never truly dies. It lingers, soft and eternal, calling across time in tones of bronze and memory. Before the first light touches the thatched roofs of the village, the road already stirs. It begins as a whisper, the distant creak of a wooden wheel, the clop of hooves muffled by frost. Mist rolls low across the fields, curling around hedgerows and fences, as travelers move like shadows between the trees. This road is not wide. It is rutted, uneven, and lined with puddles that mirror the pale dawn. Yet it is the artery of life, the path that ties one small world to another. Along it pass merchants and messengers, pilgrims and peddlers, sometimes soldiers. Every footprint pressed into its mud carries a story.
For the peasant, the road is both promise and peril. It leads to the market, where coins may change hands, where news and rumors drift like autumn leaves. But it also leads away, to towns unknown, to wars, to taxes and laws they cannot see. Most will never travel far, yet every week a few brave souls load their carts and walk that weary path toward the hum of trade and the echo of voices. The sun rises slowly, turning the mist gold. Birds stir in the hedges. The sound of a wheel breaks the silence again, nearer this time, steady and rhythmic. A farmer guides his oxen along the track, their breath steaming in the cold air. Behind him, a cart rattles with sacks of barley, bundles of wool, and baskets of eggs wrapped in straw. Ahead lies the market. He does not hurry. The road, like time, moves only at its own pace. By the time the sun climbs high, the market square awakens in full voice. It is a living tapestry, woven from shouts and laughter, the clang of metal, the rustle of sacks and straw. Stalls rise like small wooden huts, their roofs patched with cloth, their tables crowded with goods. The smell of fresh bread mingles with that of livestock and damp earth. Chickens squawk in wicker cages, sheep bleat from pens beside the churchyard wall. Bakers call out their prices, fishmongers wave silver-scaled wares, and cloth sellers unfurl bolts of wool dyed in the colors of autumn leaves. Everywhere there is movement. A blacksmith's apprentice wipes sweat from his brow as he hammers a horseshoe. Children dart between legs, chasing a loose apple. Women haggle fiercely over salt or candles, their voices sharp but not unkind. The sound of coins clinking carries above it all, a soft, metallic heartbeat of commerce. The market is more than trade. It is the meeting of lives. Here, peasants see faces from other villages, hear tongues they do not know, and learn news that has traveled farther than they ever will. Rumors of kings and wars, of famines, of miracles. A stranger might tell of lands where the rivers freeze in winter, or where the sea is so vast one cannot see the end of it. And though few believe all they hear, they listen, because the market is their window to the world beyond the fields. Among the market's noise move the peddlers, restless souls who carry their world on their backs. They come with ribbons, needles, beads, knives, and trinkets wrapped in cloth. Their coats are patched, their boots dusty from a dozen towns. They know every road, every village, every tavern where a warm fire and kind word might be found. They are wanderers, half merchants and half storytellers. When business is slow, they speak of places far away, of cities where the streets are paved with stone, of towers so tall they touch the clouds. The villagers listen with wide eyes, knowing perhaps that none of it is quite true, but enjoying the wonder all the same. A tinker sits near his cart, mending a pot with sparks flying from his small forge. Beside him, a traveling musician tunes his lute, plucking a few gentle notes that drift like smoke through the air. Children gather, laughing as he begins to sing a ballad of knights and maidens, of love and loss, though few understand all the words. For a coin or two, he'll play another tune, softer now, almost like a lullaby.
These wanderers live on the edge of two worlds, belonging nowhere, yet welcome everywhere. They bring color into the monotony of peasant life, a reminder that the world is wider than the fields and the church walls. When they leave, the road seems a little emptier, the silence deeper.
Trade in the medieval market was not only in goods, but in sensation, in the tastes and textures of the far world brought near. Honey thick as amber, coarse salt in small cloth bags, dried herbs that smelled of distant hills. On lucky days, there might be imported spices, pepper, cinnamon, or a small vial of oil so rare it cost a month's wages. The peasants gathered around such stalls in awe. Few could afford even a pinch, but to see it, to smell it, was to dream. The merchant, proud in his wool cloak, told of ships that crossed endless seas, of lands so hot the air shimmered. For the villagers, who rarely left their valley, such stories were like glimpses into another life. Food was traded not only to sustain, but to connect. A man might swap a sack of barley for cheese, or eggs for a candle. A woman might barter her spinning work for a bolt of cloth. Every exchange was a thread in the great invisible web that bound one household to another, one village to the next. As the day grew long, the smell of roasting meat drifted through the square. A boy turned a spit beside a brazier, grease hissing in the firelight. Nearby, a brewer ladled warm ale into cups. Laughter rose. A moment of small abundance in a world often starved of plenty. When the sun dips low, shadows lengthen across the market square. The noise begins to fade, one stall at a time, one cart rolling slowly away. Chickens are gathered, ropes coiled, coins counted by flickering candlelight. The day exhales. The road that led them here will lead them home again. Merchants set off first, their carts creaking under the weight of unsold goods. Peasants follow, their baskets lighter, their pockets heavier. The air smells of dust and cooling fires. Overhead, the bell tolls from the church tower. Evening again. Along the road, the travelers move in silence now. Some hum softly to keep the rhythm of their steps. Some lead tired oxen, whispering to them as to old friends. Others walk alone, their minds full of the day, the trades made, the stories heard, the coins tucked away like secret victories. For a brief time, the road becomes a ribbon of humanity stretching through the twilight, a fragile chain that binds one village to another. Beyond the fields, the first stars appear. A faint wind stirs, carrying the smell of rain and the promise of another morning, another market day, not too far away. Sometimes, at the edge of the road where it forks toward unknown lands, a figure stands apart the pilgrim. Clad in a long cloak, staff in hand, a scallop shell pinned to his hat, he walks not for trade, but for faith. His pack is light, his steps uncertain, but his eyes fixed on some far-off shrine that may take months to reach. The peasants offer him bread and a place by the fire when he passes through. In return, he tells tales of holy places, of cathedrals that gleam with glass, of relics said to heal, of miracles seen by candlelight. His stories blur the line between truth and legend, yet to the listeners, both are sacred. When morning comes, he departs quietly. The road stretches before him, pale under the dawn. No one knows where it leads, only that it always leads onward through forests, across fields of wheat and snow. And though few will ever walk so far,
They watch him go with a strange ache, as if, in his journey, they glimpse their own yearning for something beyond the horizon. When the market sleeps and the road grows silent, the world feels small again, a circle of cottages under stars. Yet in every heart the road remains. It is the line that connects the known and the unknown, the soil and the dream. The road remembers the sound of wheels, the laughter of traders, the hymns of pilgrims. It remembers the tread of bare feet and the creak of carts that passed 100 years ago. And though the men and women who walked it are long gone, the dust still carries their echoes. In spring, it will bloom again, lined with wildflowers and the hum of new voices. The market will return, with its colors and cries, its smoke and scent of bread. And life will move once more along the same old path, repeating its rhythm like a song no one ever forgets. Because in every age, there is a market, and beyond every market, a road. And the world, in its quiet turning, waits to be walked again. The year turns, not with clocks or calendars, but with the slow rhythm of the soil. Each season speaks its own language, in frost and thaw, in the hum of insects and the hush of falling leaves. To the peasant, time is measured not by numbers, but by what the earth allows. When the last snows retreat, the world exhales. The ground, once locked in silence, softens under the sun's tender gaze. Water trickles through furrows left from last year's plow, carrying with it the scent of life returning. Men walk the fields with cautious hope, boots sinking into mud, eyes turned toward the sky for signs of rain or promise. They know the cycle well. It has ruled their fathers and their fathers' fathers. The year begins not in celebration, but in labor, in the breaking of soil, in the sowing of seed, in the endless patience of waiting. As the light grows stronger, so too does the hum of the village. The sound of axes in the woods, of carts creaking, of water drawn from wells. Each noise marks the heartbeat of the land awakening once again. When March arrives, the fields become the center of all things. Men and women move across them like a quiet tide, each step deliberate, each motion ancient. The oxen plod forward, their shoulders gleaming with sweat. Behind them, the plow's blade bites into the soil, curling the dark earth in waves that smell rich and sharp. The sower follows, a simple figure with a sack slung over one shoulder. With every sweep of his arm, grain scatters into the air, glinting like dust in the morning light before falling into the furrows. He does not speak. The rhythm of his motion is a kind of prayer, a trust that from this small handful, life will return again. Birds circle overhead, watching. Children follow, laughing, sometimes gathering what falls too near the path. The fields stretch wide, their edges fading into forest. There is no sense of ownership here, only duty, a shared obedience to the rhythm of seasons older than memory. When the last seed is sown, the sower pauses and looks to the sky. If the wind is kind, he nods once. If it is cold, he tightens his cloak and walks home without a word. Either way, the world turns on. By midsummer, the earth breathes deeply. The fields rise in a sea of green, barley and wheat swaying beneath the sky's endless blue. Bees drift from flower to flower, their hum the sound of contentment. The days are long, heavy with light and labor. In these months, work never ends. Men swing scythes through the grass at dawn, their movements smooth, almost graceful. Women follow with sickles, gathering what falls into neat bundles. The rhythm of harvest begins early, though the great cutting is still to come. Each sheaf tied, each blade sharpened, prepares for that brief window when the world must be reaped before it fades again.
Children chase butterflies near the hedges. Old men rest in the shade, mending harness or carving handles. Even the animals seem to move slower, their breath warm in the shimmering air. The heat presses down like a gentle weight, making every sound soft. The clink of a scythe, the murmur of voices, the rustle of wind through grain. In the evenings, the horizon burns gold. Smoke drifts from cottages, carrying the smell of bread and stew. The people gather, tired but content, knowing that for a little while, the earth has been generous. When the first leaves begin to turn, all thought bends toward the harvest. It is the heart of the peasant's year, the time when every hand, young or old, finds work. For a few short weeks, life becomes a single, unbroken rhythm of reaping, binding, stacking, and threshing. At dawn, the fields fill with movement. The air is cool, damp with dew. Men swing their scythes in long arcs, cutting through the golden sea with a whispering sound. Behind them, women and children gather the fallen stalks, tying them into sheaves with quick, practiced hands. The bundles are lifted onto carts, the wheels creaking under the weight. Sweat glistens, backs ache, but the work goes on. At midday, they rest in the shadow of the stacks. Bread and cheese are passed around, a shared jug of ale between calloused fingers. Laughter rises easily, brief and unguarded. For all its hardship, harvest brings joy, the satisfaction of survival earned through sweat and patience. When the last cart rolls home and the fields lie bare, they give thanks. A small prayer, whispered more from habit than ceremony, drifts toward the evening sky. Let the grain be enough. Let the winter be kind. After the harvest, the world slows. The fields lie quiet, their stubble glinting pale under the low sun. The air smells of smoke, not from battle, but from hearths where grain is dried and fruit is preserved. Apples and onions hang from rafters. Sacks of barley line the walls. The barns grow full, the hearts lighter. It is a time for mending, tools, fences, and spirits. Men repair thatch, sharpen plows, patch worn clothes. Women spin by the fire, their fingers nimble in the soft glow. Outside, geese gather near the pond, restless before migration. The evenings draw longer, and with them come songs, slow, circular melodies sung by low voices, winding like the smoke above their chimneys. Autumn is the gentlest of teachers. It reminds them that every abundance fades, that every full barn will one day empty. Yet it also whispers of gratitude, of enoughness. To the medieval peasant, contentment was never born of plenty, but of survival. A full belly, a warm bed, a roof that does not leak. These were miracles enough. Winter does not arrive suddenly. It creeps in, quiet and certain, softening the edges of the world. Frost gathers in the furrows, water hardens to glass, and the last green fades beneath a blanket of white. The fields, once loud with work, now sleep. Only the crows remain, black against the snow,
searching for what the harvest left behind. The peasants turn inward to the glow of their hearths and the small warmth of shared bodies. The road grows empty. The bell's toll seems sharper in the cold air. Yet winter is not only hardship, it is also peace. In the stillness, time stretches. Men tell stories by the fire. Women mend old garments. Children play in the ash and straw. Outside, the moon casts long blue shadows over the frozen earth. The silence becomes a kind of comfort, the breathing of the land at rest. And though hunger and cold press close, the people endure. They know deep within that the wheel will turn again, that spring waits beneath the frost, patient and unseen. In the rhythm of the seasons lies the quiet truth of their world. Nothing ends, everything turns. The same soil that swallows the seed will yield it again. The same sun that scorches will soften. The same hands that toil will one day rest. For the medieval peasant, this was not philosophy, but fact. The cycle of the fields was the cycle of life itself. Birth, growth, harvest, decay, and rebirth. Every furrow dug was a promise, every harvest a reckoning. They lived by the patience of the earth and died trusting its return. And so, as the snow melts once more and the first green shoots pierce the thawing ground, the people step out again into the light. Their backs may ache, their hands may tremble, but their hearts remember. Because even in the coldest winter, the fields have always kept their promise. The fields are not silent. They speak in whispers the heart can hear. They speak of hunger and hope, of labor and loss, of a love older than words, the bond between human and soil. When all else fades, castles crumble, names vanish from record, the fields remain. They hold the footprints of countless generations, the bones of those who once bent to them, the seeds of those yet to come. And in their quiet turning, they keep the memory of every hand that ever sowed or reaped. For in truth, the earth has never belonged to man. It is man who belongs to the earth. When the harvest had been gathered and the granaries filled, the peasants' world softened for a short, golden time. The fields that had groaned with work grew quiet, and even the animals in the byres seemed to rest easier, their breath rising in slow clouds of contentment. It was during these brief weeks after the harvest that life took on a gentler rhythm, a reprieve before the long months of cold and hunger crept near again. The peasants gathered in courtyards to thresh the grain, singing low songs whose words had been passed from father to son. Each swing of the flail struck like the heartbeat of the land itself, steady, rhythmic, unchanging. Children ran among piles of straw, laughing, their bare feet kicking up the last warmth of the soil. The elders sat by the walls, eyes half closed, listening to the song of the season's end. Feasting came then, not out of luxury, but gratitude. The bread was thick and dark, the ale young and sharp. A single pig might be slaughtered to mark the turning of the year. Neighbors would gather in the cool twilight, the smoke from their fires rising in gentle spirals to the stars. The laughter was modest, the dancing slow, and the joy a quiet one. For every man and woman knew that the days of scarcity would come again soon. In those evenings, when the air smelled of burnt straw and roasted barley, the villagers looked out over their fields and saw beauty in exhaustion. The land was bare, the trees yellowing, yet the moment held a fragile peace, the kind that comes only to those who have worked, endured, and earned their brief rest. By the end of November, the feasting songs had faded. The cold pressed against the doors like a slow tide. The granaries that once seemed full began to empty faster than expected. Grain shrank in the bins. Rats grew bold. Every handful measured became an act of calculation. How much to spare today, how much to keep for spring. The women baked bread from coarse meal, mixing barley, rye, and whatever could stretch the flour further. The smell was earthy, bitter. Butter hardened like stone in its crock, and the cheese grew thin. Each morning the same question hovered. How long will it last? The men went into the woods for firewood, though the best trees had long been claimed. They cut down branches, their hands numb and split, their breath white in the dim air. The forest was quiet but for the creak of axes and the sigh of snow falling from the higher boughs. Inside, children clung to their mothers for warmth. Ash drifted from the hearth and settled on everything, on hair, on cloth, even on bread. Yet, though hardship lay ahead, there was no sense of panic. It was an old rhythm, as ancient as the soil. The peasants did not fight the hunger. They simply learned to fold themselves around it, to sleep early, to chew slower, to endure. Even in the heart of winter, when the wind was a blade and hunger crouched at the door, the people still found reasons to gather. The calendar of the church offered moments of warmth: St. Martin, St. Nicholas, Epiphany. Each was a thread of light woven through the months of shadow. The church bell would ring, slow and solemn, carrying across the snow-bound fields. From every path and hut, villagers trudged toward it, cloaked in wool, faces wrapped against the wind. They brought what they could: a crust of bread, a jug of ale, a single candle to share the flame. The priest's voice echoed softly through the nave, rising with the smoke of incense and breath. After the prayers came a shared meal, small but sacred. A bowl of pottage passed from hand to hand, a bit of salt pork divided among 10. And though the taste was meager, the togetherness filled the void that food could not. There was laughter again, faint but real, and stories whispered by the old, of warmer winters, of miracles, of the goodness of endurance. For one night, the cold outside lost its teeth. The people, gathered beneath the arches of faith, felt what the church promised: not plenty, but peace. When the frost deepened and even the rivers turned to glass, the true famine began. This was the time they called the hunger moon, February, when stores ran low and the earth slept on, refusing to give anything yet. Meals shrank to little more than broth made from bones. If a rabbit was caught, it was a gift. If not, the pot held water and herbs, and little else. Some chewed bark or boiled old leather. The dogs, once companions, were eyed with quiet sorrow. Not every household survived the lean months. Yet through this hunger, there was also a strange, enduring grace. People learned to be silent, to move slowly, to keep warm with patience instead of fuel. Neighbors helped one another without speaking of it. A woman might slip a handful of grain into another's sack. A man might share the last of his salted fish with a widow. It was not charity. It was simply how life continued. The sound of the church bell, faint through the fog, was both a comfort and a reminder. The world was still turning, and spring would come. Someday, the thaw would return, and the smell of wet earth would fill the air again. When the first thaw came, it was not joy, but disbelief that spread through the village. Water dripped from eaves, mud softened beneath boots, and crows called again from the trees. The peasants ventured outside and saw life returning. Faint green shoots in the ditches, a trickle of water over the frozen stream. Soon, with the snow retreating, came the first true feast of spring. Bread baked from the last of the old flour. Eggs gathered from hens who had begun to lay again. It was a humble table, yet there was laughter now, soft, cautious, but genuine. That night, as the sky cleared and the stars returned, the peasants sat beside their fires and spoke of survival. They did not speak of heroism or triumph. To live through winter was not victory, but continuity. The simple persistence of breath, of motion, of tending the world until it warmed again. And when the next harvest came, the feast would be fuller, the songs louder. Yet somewhere, in each heart, the memory of famine would remain. It was this memory that gave weight to every loaf, every smile, every prayer. To the medieval peasant, the year was not divided by dates or numbers, but by hunger and by feast. One could not exist without the other. The abundance of harvest was savored precisely because famine had been endured. Every grain of barley was a victory against the void. Their lives, shaped by soil and season, carried an honesty that modern eyes can only glimpse from afar, a quiet courage in repetition, a beauty in survival. The peasants did not seek greatness. They sought to see another spring. And when they did, the sound of the church bell and the taste of fresh bread became, for a moment, something divine. At the far edge of every village stood the manor, a shape against the hills that seemed older than the sky itself. It was not grand in the way of palaces or castles, but it loomed large over those who tilled the land beneath it. Its walls of stone, streaked with moss and weather, watched silently as the peasants bent their backs in the fields. In spring it was wrapped in mist. In winter it looked carved from the very frost that covered the ground. The manor belonged to the Lord, not always a cruel man, nor always a kind one, but always distant. His house was the embodiment of order and burden, a place that reminded the peasant of the line that divided his world from the world of those above. The Lord's word could summon or forgive, demand or dismiss. His tax collectors walked the muddy roads like migrating birds, appearing when the stores were fullest and leaving the barns echoing and hollow once more. To the peasant, the manor was both protector and predator. Its walls meant defense against raiders and thieves, but they also marked the weight of obligation. Each man and woman owed labor or grain to its stone halls, a share of what their hands had shaped, their bodies had bent to harvest. It was said the manor's hearth never went cold, even when the village's fires died down to ash. Children looked up at the manor with awe. They whispered that knights lived there, men who shone like morning with swords that glimmered like rivers. But the older ones knew that the gleam of steel meant something else, that the peace of the fields was paid for by the sweat of their work and the bending of their knees. In the evenings, when the bell from the church faded into the distance, the manor's torches would still burn. Sometimes, from far below, one could see shadows moving behind its windows,
figures at table, the glint of a goblet, a silhouette standing by the fire. To the peasants, those were glimpses into another kind of life, unreachable, unchangeable, yet forever present above them. And so, the manor became not just a building, but an idea. It was the mountain against which the small lives of the village leaned, immovable, unquestioned, both a shelter and a burden.
It was always the same sound that broke the rhythm of the village, the creak of wagon wheels, the ring of iron-shod hooves. The tax collector came not in haste, but in inevitability. He moved through the lanes as though the roads themselves bowed to his passage. 2 guards followed behind him, their spears upright, faces expressionless beneath their helmets. Doors opened, then closed again. Mothers pulled children indoors. Men straightened, brushing straw from their tunics. They knew what was owed, and they knew that argument had no place here. The collector carried a ledger, a thick book bound in leather and iron clasps. In it were written names, weights, and measures. A life reduced to columns of grain and coin. He spoke little, his tone neither cruel nor kind, only precise. The peasants stood before him one by one, offering the tax they had set aside, a sack of barley, a handful of coins, a sheaf of flax. Each offering was weighed, measured, recorded, and taken. Sometimes a man would beg for time. The crop was thin, he might say. The frost took the week before it was ripe. The collector would note it down, nodding slowly, and double the amount next season. There was no anger in him, only the calmness of someone who carried the weight of a system older than both his birth and theirs. To the villagers, he was not a man, but an instrument, a moving hand of the manor itself. When he left, the sound of hooves faded slowly down the road, and a silence fell. A few stood watching until the last glimmer of armor disappeared. Then, with a shared breath, they returned to their tools and their work. There was nothing else to do. Inside the manor, warmth was a constant thing. The hearth roared. Candles glowed in iron sconces. Tapestries softened the echo of stone. The air smelled of meat, wax, and smoke, rich smells that never reached the cottages below. The Lord sat at his long table, flanked by stewards and clerks. Before him lay parchments, coins, and tokens of the land's yield, jars of honey, bolts of wool, a brace of pigeons. His fingers brushed each item, not greedily, but with the familiarity of ownership. The manor's great hall was not a place of laughter, but of ledgers. Each number written represented a family's labor, and each debt collected ensured that the manor would stand through another season. The Lord himself often believed he was just. He oversaw the repairs of the church roof, granted grain to the priest, sent a tithe to his own liege. He was the spine of the local world, holding it upright. Yet between his comfort and their hunger stretched an invisible gulf that no word could bridge. At night, when the hall grew quiet and the fire dimmed, the Lord would sometimes stand at the high window and look down upon the dark village below. The pinpricks of cottage fires looked like fallen stars scattered in the fields. He might murmur a prayer, or simply turn away. In every peasant's life, the manor was both origin and end. Their fathers had sworn oaths of service, and their sons would do the same. These oaths were rarely spoken aloud after the first time. They lived instead in the hands, in the daily work, in the silence of acceptance. To till the Lord's field before one's own was an act of loyalty, but also survival. It was said that the land bound all men together, from the lowest plowman to the highest knight. But the bonds were not equal. A missed day of labor, an unpaid measure of grain, a broken tool left unfixed. Each could mean punishment, or worse, debt. Some tried to run. The forest was vast, the world beyond unknown. But most returned, drawn back by hunger, by the fear of law, or simply by the pull of what was familiar. Freedom was a word whispered by firelight, beautiful but unreal. And so the oath continued, not through choice, but through inheritance. The Lord provided walls, and in return, the peasant gave his life in fractions. One seed, one coin, one breath at a time. By early spring, when the tax had been gathered and the ledgers closed, a strange quiet fell over the manor and the village. The wagons had departed, loaded with grain and cloth. The barns echoed with emptiness, yet the peasants' faces were calm. They had done what was required. They had endured as they always had. The land would bloom again, and they would work it for themselves, for their families, for the manor. There was no question in it, only rhythm. Sometimes, in the stillness after the tax season, a villager would stand on a ridge and look up toward the manor's silhouette. It seemed, at certain hours, almost peaceful, softened by the haze, its sharp lines blurred by distance. Perhaps, they thought, those who lived within were bound as well, caught in the same turning wheel of duty and expectation. And in a quiet way, that thought brought comfort. If both peasant and lord were trapped in the same circle, then perhaps no one was truly free. And perhaps that was the nature of life itself.
The manor and its taxes were not just instruments of power. They were the architecture of medieval life itself. Through their burdens, the villagers found rhythm. Through their servitude, they found endurance. It was a world built not on rebellion, but on acceptance, not on glory, but on survival. The Lord's wealth and the peasant's labor were threads of the same cloth, woven through centuries of hunger and harvest, faith and fatigue. And though time would one day sweep away both manor and field, the echo of their bond of giving, owing, enduring would remain in the soil, in the stones, in the quiet hum of history. In every medieval village, life began quietly. There were no doctors, no silver instruments, no midwives in fine linen. Only the hands of women, a pot of warm water, and prayers whispered to saints whose names had softened through generations. Birth came most often at night, when the fields lay silent, and the only light was the flicker of a tallow candle. The wind outside might have been singing through the cracks of the door, or the dogs might have barked far off toward the woods. Inside the cottage, everything smelled of straw, wood smoke, and sweat. A child's first cry was both a relief and a warning. It meant another mouth to feed, another soul to guide through the hard seasons. Yet it was also a sign of grace, proof that life still pushed forward, even in a world so often bowed by hunger and death. Women gathered around the mother, steadying her, murmuring soft encouragements. The men waited outside, pretending to work, though their ears strained for that sound, that first thin wail that would carry through the air like a promise. When the baby came, it was wrapped in old cloth,
held close to the fire until its skin lost the chill. There was no time for ceremony. Survival itself was baptism enough. Yet the very next morning, the family would walk to the church. The priest, still sleepy and wrapped in his robe, would pour the cold water over the child's head and mark its name into the parish book, a small line in a long, unbroken ledger of births and deaths. The villagers would speak softly of the newborn for a few days, and then life would move on. The fields did not stop growing, nor the animals waiting to be fed. The mother would soon return to work, her baby swaddled and carried on her back while she weeded the furrows. Childhood began, not in play, but in motion in the rhythm of the land.
By the time they could walk, the children belonged to the soil. Their first toys were stones, sticks, and bits of straw twisted into the shapes of animals. They followed their parents into the fields, small shadows among taller ones, learning without instruction how to sow, gather, mend, and carry. In summer, they drove the geese toward the ponds, shouting and laughing, their feet brown with dust. In winter, they fetched kindling or ground barley with small wooden pestles. Work was not punishment. It was life, the steady rhythm that carried the village through each year. The older ones cared for the younger. A girl of 8 might have an infant bound to her back, her small frame bent under the weight, her hands still busy shelling peas. Boys were sent to watch the fields or scare crows, waving sticks and calling out songs that echoed against the hills. Education came in murmured stories, in repetition, in example. A father's hand guided a plow, a mother's voice taught prayer. They learned the saints by name, the seasons by smell, the weather by watching the sky. Yet, for all their labor, there was laughter. When work ended and the shadows lengthened, the children would race between the cottages, chasing one another through the dust, their voices rising like birds. They did not know poverty, only the shape of the world that had always been. Even in hardship, children found ways to imagine. A flat stone could become a castle, a stick a knight's sword. They played by the wells, on the paths between fields, under the watchful eyes of women mending clothes. The laughter of children was the softest sound of hope the village ever heard, proof that not everything bowed beneath the weight of hunger. At night, they dreamed of strange things. Some dreamt of the manor and its shining torches. Others imagined the sea, though they had never seen one. They had heard travelers speak of distant lands where cities touched the clouds, and the sun never hid behind fog. The old men smiled when they heard such tales. They knew the dreams would fade with time, replaced by work, family, and the steady turn of seasons. Still, for a few brief years, the children carried something the adults had lost, the sense that the world was larger than their valley. They did not yet understand the weight of the Lord's tax, or the ache of hunger, or the cold indifference of winter. Their play was their freedom, short-lived and precious. When the bell from the church tolled in the distance, they ran home across the fields, their laughter falling away into the night. The sky above them, gray and wide, seemed to hold their voices for a moment before swallowing them whole.
While the children carried the beginning of life, the old bore its quiet end. They were the memory of the village, the last keepers of stories, of proverbs, of faces long gone. In every cottage there was at least one elder whose world had grown small. A chair by the fire, a bowl of broth, and the steady watching of days passing by the door. Their hands were twisted, their backs bent, but their eyes still shone with something deeper, the calm that comes from having endured too much to fear what remains. The old spoke little, but when they did, their words carried the weight of the past. They told of winters harsher than any remembered, of famines survived by faith and cunning. They spoke of saints who had walked the earth and of fields once blessed by miracles. The children listened with wide eyes, their imaginations weaving light from the fire into the shapes of heroes and angels. Sometimes the old would simply sit in silence, stroking a dog, watching the play of shadows on the walls. They had learned the art of patience, of breathing without expectation, of existing quietly within the circle of time. In spring, they were carried outside to feel the sun again. In winter, they were wrapped in furs and kept near the hearth. Death came softly for them, more often from weariness than from pain, and when it came, the village did not weep loudly. They buried the old as they had lived, with humility, with earth, and with prayer. There were moments when the youngest and the oldest sat together, moments when time itself seemed to fold. A child would bring a crust of bread to share, or the old would hum a song that no one else remembered. Between them, no words were needed. One was just beginning to see the world, the other was preparing to leave it. The village seemed to exist in those brief exchanges, the handing of stories, the passing of laughter, the shared silence of understanding. It was in this continuity that meaning was found. Life was not measured in years or wealth, but in the endurance of memory. When spring returned and the bell called the faithful to the church, both children and elders walked the same road together, one slow, one skipping. And in the rhythm of their footsteps lay the essence of the medieval world, struggle, simplicity, and the quiet persistence of the human spirit. The children and the old formed the two ends of the peasant's world, beginnings and endings joined by toil and faith. Between them flowed the countless unnamed lives that filled the centuries, lives that sowed, wept, endured, and dreamed. In them was the proof that history is not only written by kings or wars, but by the quiet passage of breath through generations. Their stories, like the faint echo of a bell at dusk, still linger somewhere in the earth, in the wind, in the dim corners of memory. Evening falls slowly across the medieval valley. The light weakens, stretching thin over the bare ridges and the hedgerows that divide the land. The last smoke of the day drifts upward from the cottages, carrying with it the faint scent of peat and boiled grain. From afar, the fields look almost motionless, except for a few figures returning home, their steps heavy, their tools dragging behind them through the frost-touched grass. The plow is left standing in the furrow. The oxen are led back to the byre, their breaths visible in the cooling air. Somewhere, a bell rings once, twice, and then fades, calling no one in particular, only reminding the living that another day has ended. The peasants closed their gates, gathered the children, and pulled the shutters tight. The sounds of life contract inward, the whisper of straw, the clatter of a latch, the tired sigh of a woman setting down a wooden bowl. Beyond the hedges, the land turns gray, and the outlines of the forest deepen into a single dark mass. Night arrives not as a storm, but as a slow forgetting. The colors of the world sink into shades of iron and ash. Within the cottage, the evening ritual begins. A log is placed on the fire. A child curls beneath a rough wool blanket. The older ones whisper stories learned from their parents. The single room glows faintly, its light trembling on the low beams. A bowl of broth steams beside the hearth. The bread is hard, but dipped into the broth it softens enough to share. Hands pass it in silence, and each gesture carries its own familiarity, the practiced rhythm of a life lived close to necessity. A mother hums, not quite a song, but a rhythm meant to still the air. A baby stirs, then quiets again. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, the sound lost in the fog. The fire lowers, revealing the red heart of the coals. Every movement slows until there is nothing but breath and warmth and the quiet ticking of unseen embers breaking apart. Outside, the village sleeps. The streets are narrow lines of mud and stone, winding between cottages like forgotten veins. Moonlight, when it comes, slides across thatch and frozen puddles, catching the faint gleam of iron nails in wooden doors. No voice carries far. The only sound is the slow shifting of animals in their stalls, the stamp of a hoof, the low breath of a cow, the rustle of straw. Somewhere, a single candle still burns behind a window, the home of someone keeping vigil, or perhaps unable to sleep. Above, the sky is vast and cold, the stars scattered thin like salt over slate. The villagers believe each star holds a soul. When one vanishes, they cross themselves and whisper a name. The wind turns colder. It moves through the village like a ghost, tugging at roofs, slipping under doors, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. Not everyone sleeps. On certain nights, the watchman makes his rounds. Wrapped in a heavy cloak, carrying a small lantern, he moves from one end of the village to the other, his footsteps dull against the frozen ground. He stops at the bell tower. The great bell above him has no need to ring, yet he touches the rope lightly, as if greeting an old friend. For centuries it has marked time, birth, death, prayer, and warning. Tonight it rests, silent as the graves that lie beyond the churchyard wall. He looks toward the horizon, where a faint mist clings to the river. Somewhere beyond it lies the Lord's manor, its windows faintly aglow. Between that distant light and his own stands the entire life of the peasant, short, laborious, enduring. He turns back toward the cottages, the lantern swinging, scattering weak circles of light that dissolve into the night. Sleep spreads slowly through the village. In each cottage, dreams rise like smoke, soft, fragile, and strange. A child dreams of summer fields filled with tall grain. A farmer dreams of rain that never ends. An old woman dreams of the faces she has lost. Their dreams mingle in the still air, invisible but present, as if the night itself listens. The wind outside presses against the walls, testing for weakness, but the fire's faint glow pushes it back. In the hush of those hours, the world feels suspended, as if time itself is holding its breath. All the worries of hunger and debt, all the aches of labor, vanish for a moment beneath the gentle weight of rest. And somewhere, beneath that stillness, the earth turns quietly, carrying them through another uncounted night. Before dawn, the silence breaks, not with sound, but with a subtle change in color. The darkness softens. The sky at the edge of the horizon begins to pale, and the air feels different, thinner, expectant. A rooster crows once, then again. A dog stirs. A faint smoke thread rises from a chimney where someone has woken early to tend the fire. Soon, the bell will ring the first hour, and the peasants will step out once more into the fields. Night has ended, though it will return again, as it always does, patient, infinite, and unhurried. In its silence, the village has rested. In its stillness, life has endured. Nightfall in the medieval world was not emptiness, but renewal. Beneath the quiet and the cold, life gathered itself for another day. The silence was never total. It held the heartbeat of survival, the steady breathing of those who had learned to live between the hours of work and rest. The darkness of their nights was not despair, it was peace. A peace shaped by endurance, humility, and the knowledge that even in a world of endless labor, the stars still watched above. And so, as each night returned, the village welcomed it not with fear, but with a tired, grateful sigh, knowing that in the silence they were closest to grace. The road that cut through the far edge of the valley was older than the bell tower or the Lord's stone keep. It ran like a brown scar between low hills, turning to mud after rain and dust after drought. In the still hours of early spring, the peasants sometimes paused at the edge of their fields and looked toward it. Nothing moved there for days. Then, one afternoon, the faint rhythm of footsteps could be heard. A line of figures appeared through the haze, men and women in patched cloaks, children on their backs, staffs tapping the stones. They carried gourds, wooden crosses, and the small pewter badges of distant shrines. Their faces were browned by weather and pilgrimage. They passed the fields in silence, eyes lowered, lips moving in prayer. The peasants made the sign of the cross and watched until the travelers dissolved into the far curve of the road. For a moment, the valley felt larger, as if it opened onto all the unseen places of the world. Then the sound faded, and the villagers turned again to their furrows, the echo of those slow footsteps lingering in the soil. 18. When pilgrims reached the village at dusk, the bell had already rung, and smoke hung low over the thatch. The travelers asked for nothing, but custom demanded charity. A door opened, a hand gestured them inside. Inside the common hall, they sat by the hearth while steam rose from a pot of barley broth. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything. A woman cut coarse bread and placed it before them. No words of welcome were needed. Hospitality was its own language. One pilgrim removed his shoes, the skin beneath cracked and red from frost. Another held his hands out to the fire, whispering a psalm. Children peeked from behind benches, staring at the badges sewn to the strangers' cloaks. A small tin shell, a stamped cross, a fragment of ribbon. Each was a story. The travelers bowed their heads before eating, and the villagers bowed too. The silence was gentle, filled only by the hiss of the pot and the slow breathing of tired people who shared warmth without question. Later, when the bowls were empty and the children had fallen asleep, one of the travelers began to speak. His voice was low and even, shaped by the miles he had walked. He told of the road to Canterbury, of shrines where candles burned day and night, of a relic said to cure the blind. Another spoke of storms on the western sea, of cities built of stones so white they shone beneath the moon. The peasants listened, their faces lit by the hearth. They would never see those places, yet for a moment they felt the wind from them, the salt air, the noise of markets, the bells of other lands. An old man crossed himself and whispered that the world was wider than sin. When the talk ended, they sat in companionable silence. Outside, the night deepened. The pilgrims drifted into sleep where they sat, their heads bowed like those of saints in old paintings. At dawn, the pilgrims left a small token at the edge of the village, a piece of wax shaped like a foot, offered for safe passage. They walked to the river where an ancient wooden cross stood half buried in moss. There they knelt, washing their faces in the cold water, murmuring prayers. A few villagers followed at a distance, watching. The ritual was simple, older than memory. The travelers pressed their palms to the wood of the cross and then to the earth, thanking both. One woman took a handful of river stones and left behind a sprig of thyme. Then they rose, adjusted their cloaks, and turned back toward the road. The villagers lingered a while after they had gone. The air smelled of wet soil and smoke from the morning fires. For a brief moment, even the slow river seemed to pause, as if listening to the echo of the pilgrims' prayers. By mid-morning, the pilgrims had vanished down the southern road, their footprints filled with water from the thawing frost. The children ran to the edge of the fields and waved until the last figure disappeared behind the hill. The peasants returned to their labor, but the memory of the visitors stayed with them through the day. They spoke quietly of the relics the travelers sought, of the distant abbeys where candles burned in endless rows. The thought of those lights comforted them, the idea that somewhere prayers were rising for all souls, even theirs. That night, when the fields turned silver with moonlight, the peasants dreamed of roads that wound forever through the mist, of faces passing them in silence, each bound toward some holy place beyond sight. Weeks later, the road was empty again, but it never seemed the same. Each traveler left a trace, a thought, a prayer, a bit of dust on the wind. Sometimes the peasants would pause at sunset and imagine they heard voices carried from far away, like songs blending with the sigh of the fields. The road would always lead somewhere they could not follow, yet they felt bound to it all the same. It was the line that connected their hidden valley to the world's vast silence. Every soul who walked it carried a piece of the village with them, and perhaps left something of grace behind. When the bell rang for evening prayer, its echo stretched outward along the empty road until it faded into the distance where earth met sky. The peasants crossed themselves and went inside, content to know that beyond the horizon others still walked and the world still moved. The first frost came quietly. It slipped down from the northern hills one night when the moon was thin and the world was still. By dawn, the earth was pale with silver, every blade of grass edged with glass. The air had lost its softness. It rang faintly when a crow called from the field. The peasants knew the sign well. It was not yet the cruelest season, but the frost was a herald, a soft voice before the long silence. They drew water from the well more carefully, wary of the thin ice that had begun to form. The children ran their fingers along the frozen wood of the troughs and marveled at how the world had changed overnight. In the village square, the last apples were gathered, and the final sheaves of grain were stored in the lofts. The smell of smoke began to cling to the houses, drifting in steady curls from the chimneys. Men stacked the last of the firewood in neat rows. Women stitched blankets from worn tunics and spoke little as they worked. Every sound felt slower, the thud of a door, the shuffle of boots, the crack of kindling. And when night fell again, the stars burned hard and distant, as though they belonged to another world entirely. The peasants whispered prayers to keep the frost from creeping into their bones, and the world slipped one breath closer to winter. By midwinter, the doors of every cottage were sealed against the wind. Straw filled the gaps between planks, and cloth hung thick across the thresholds. The sound of the wind against the roofs became constant, like a sea that never rested. Inside, life folded in on itself. The animals were brought close, hens clucking beneath benches, a goat tethered near the hearth. Children slept wrapped in sheepskin, their breath misting in the air. Every morning began with the strike of flint and the spark that meant survival. The villagers spoke softly now. Voices carried strangely in the stillness, as though the walls themselves were listening. Sometimes the cold grew so deep that even the smoke from the fire would fall heavy and drift sideways across the floor. There were no visitors, no travelers, no bells from the church, only the sound of wood creaking as it froze and thawed again. In such silence, thoughts became loud. Some remembered old songs. Others muttered prayers in the half-dark. Outside, the snow gathered layer upon layer, covering paths and fences alike, until the world was nothing but white and shadow.
Time lost its measure in those months. Daylight arrived late and left early, pressing the villagers into a kind of slow dreaming. They told stories to pass the hours, tales of saints and miracles, of wolves driven back by holy relics, of springs that healed the sick. The stories were as old as the land, worn smooth by centuries of retelling. An old woman, half-blind and bent with years, spoke of the time the river froze so hard that a cart could cross it. The children leaned close, eyes wide, the firelight trembling in them like candles. Another man spoke of a star that once fell near the village, burning blue in the snow. No one asked whether it was true. In winter, belief itself was warmth. Sometimes, when the fire burned low, they sat in silence, listening to the faint hiss of logs and the slow breathing of those who slept. The night outside was immense and soundless, but within the cottage, life continued in its small, stubborn rhythm, the crackle of flame, the heartbeat of waiting. One morning, the sound of coughing broke the stillness. A child's weak voice, then another. The cold had crept too deep into their lungs. The mother sat by the hearth with a damp cloth and whispered a prayer to Saint Roch, the protector against plague. The candle beside her flickered, its flame thin and trembling. Illness in winter was like a shadow unseen, but ever near. When one fell sick, the others moved slower, speaking little, as though their breath might disturb some invisible spirit. The village priest came once, his cloak heavy with frost. He sprinkled water that turned to ice the moment it touched the floor. He said the words of comfort, but his eyes showed the same quiet fear. Days passed in a blur of tending, feeding, waiting. Some recovered, others did not. The small graveyard by the church grew whiter with snow, the mounds beneath it hidden, but never forgotten. Yet each evening, as the bell tolled softly in the wind, the people knelt and prayed, not in despair, but in weary hope. It was the only light that would not go out. And then, one morning, the frost began to melt. It did not happen all at once, but in whispers, the drip of water from the eaves, the sigh of branches freed from ice. The air smelled faintly of earth again, damp and raw. Children pressed their faces to the window and watched as snow slid from the roofs in heavy sheets. The men pushed open the long frozen doors and stood blinking at the light. The sky was still pale and cold, but there was movement in it, a softness. The river cracked open in places,
black water glinting through the ice. Birds returned first as distant flecks of motion, then as voices. Work began again slowly. Fences were lifted, paths cleared, tools repaired. The villagers moved stiffly, as though awakening from a long sleep. But their eyes were brighter now, their laughter sudden and small, like fire kindled from embers. The world had survived its silence. When the first crocus pushed through the thawing soil, someone saw it and said nothing, only smiled. It was a fragile thing, bending in the cold wind, but it meant that the wheel of time had turned once more. The fields, still muddy and half frozen, awaited the plow. The bell rang again for morning prayers, echoing across puddles and wet stone. Smoke rose cleanly from every chimney. In each home, people whispered the same thought. Another winter lived through. That night, as stars returned to the sky and frost glimmered faintly once more, the villagers felt a peace they could not name. The silence of winter had not been empty after all. It had been full of endurance, faith, and small, unseen mercies. They slept deeply, not because the cold had gone, but because they knew it always would. It began with light, not warmth, not color, only the soft lengthening of days. The peasants noticed it first in the way the shadows shifted across the walls of their cottages, and in the faint glimmer that lingered just a little longer each evening. After months of gray skies, this slow change felt almost holy. The ground was still cold, but the frost no longer bit so deep. Mist rose from the river like smoke, blurring the line between earth and sky. Birds sang again in broken phrases, as though remembering their songs after forgetting them all winter. In the fields, patches of dark soil appeared where the snow had retreated. The men stood quietly at the edges, turning the dirt with their boots, testing its give. They said nothing, but their eyes were full of the season that waited just beyond the chill. At night, when the wind softened and the stars returned, the villagers sat by their fires and spoke of seeds, tools, and the promise of lambing. Hope, once frozen beneath the ground, stirred again, unseen. When the first true warmth touched the valley, the men brought out the plows. The tools were heavy and worn from years of use, their iron edges dulled but still steady. The oxen, thick from winter fodder, moved slowly through the slush, steam rising from their flanks. The soil, dark and wet, gave way under the blades. Each furrow carved was a small act of faith, faith that the earth, though frozen for months, would still bear food. The smell of fresh earth filled the air, rich and deep. The villagers worked in silence, each step measured, their breath clouding in the morning sun. Children ran along the edges of the fields, chasing crows. Women carried baskets of seed and watched as the lines of earth unfolded behind the plows, like pages being opened after a long silence. Every motion felt ancient and familiar, as though time itself repeated its first lesson. And above them, the sky was blue once more, a clean, endless blue, like a promise kept. The river, which had slept beneath ice and silence, awoke with a low, constant murmur. Its banks were soft and slick, and the sound of running water filled the valley like music. The villagers went to draw water again, their buckets dipping and rising with a rhythm older than memory. Children splashed along the shallows, laughing as the cold water stung their feet. The women washed linen and laid it on stones to dry. The air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke, and somewhere, far off, a lark sang. At sunset, the river caught the color of the sky, gold turning to rose, rose fading into violet. For the first time in many months, the peasants lingered outside after the bell had rung. They watched the reflection of light ripple across the water and spoke quietly of the days to come, of barley to be sown, of roofs to be mended, of weddings postponed until the thaw. It was a gentle hour, filled not with urgency, but with the deep calm that comes before work begins again. Weeks later, the first shoots appeared, pale and trembling at the edges of the fields. The peasants bent close to see them, as if unsure they were real. Small leaves unfolded like tiny hands, and with them came a silence different from winter's, a silence of awe. Everywhere the world softened, the woods filled with the hum of bees, and moss returned to the stones. The air carried the scent of earth and sap. Even the animals changed. The cows gave milk again, and lambs staggered through the meadows, their bleats high and thin. The peasants worked without hurry, yet with quiet purpose. The memory of hardship still lingered in their bones, but it no longer weighed them down. It reminded them instead of how the soil always gives back what it takes. They planted, watered, and waited, as their ancestors had done 1,000 times before.
When the first flowers bloomed near the churchyard, the priest called for a small feast. It was not grand, no lordly celebration, no banners or trumpets, only bread, ale, and laughter shared in the open air. The villagers gathered beneath the budding trees. Tables were rough and uneven, cups mismatched. Yet the sound of their voices filled the valley as though the world itself had drawn a new breath. The children wore garlands of early blossoms. The old raised toasts to years survived. A single musician played a flute carved from willow, its notes bright and simple. The sound drifted with the wind, mingling with the scent of baking bread. Even the church bell seemed gentler that day, its toll soft and round, as if blessing the moment. It was not joy in the loud sense, but in the quiet one, a warmth that grew slowly, like light returning after a long absence. As days grew longer, the rhythm of life returned. The fields filled with green, the roofs dried in the sun, and laughter became a sound of habit again. Children played along the road, scattering petals. Old men sat by doors carving handles for tools. The memory of winter faded, not erased, but folded gently away, part of the same pattern as the thaw, the growth, the harvest yet to come. The peasants did not speak of survival anymore. They simply lived. One evening, as dusk gathered over the valley, the bell rang for prayer. The sound carried over the fields, over the river, over the distant road where pilgrims still walked. The sky glowed with the last light of spring, and for a moment, the entire village seemed to breathe in unison, a single heart beating softly beneath the endless turning of the seasons. The year turns again. It always does. In the valley, where the wind once howled through frozen rafters and the bells lay mute beneath the snow, life moves once more in soft, steady rhythm. The peasants wake before dawn, the same as their fathers and their fathers before them. The smell of bread rises through the small windows. Smoke curls upward, thin and silver in the morning sun. The fields stretch wide and green again, furrowed by hands that never stop working. The same road that once carried the pilgrims south now lies warm under dust,
its stones glinting faintly in the light. Children chase each other along its edge. The laughter carries where once only footsteps echoed. In the heart of the village, the bell rings not with sorrow, not with fear, but with the steady comfort of continuity. Its sound passes through the air like a memory, crossing rooftops and meadows, reaching even the edge of the forest where birds rise in small flocks. It is a sound the world has heard for centuries, a call to prayer, a call to meal, a call to simply remember that life goes on. When the sun lowers and the air grows cool, the villagers gather outside their doors. The elders sit on stools carved from old oak. The children play until the light fades from the hills. And as the last glow of day slips into blue, the sounds of work fall away. The only thing left is the hum of the earth, the insects, the slow movement of water, the faint sigh of wind through wheat.
In those moments, one can almost hear the centuries speaking. Every winter endured, every seed planted, every prayer whispered against the silence. All of it lives here, beneath the soil and the stars. The peasants of this village, long forgotten by name, were never truly lost. Their lives became the rhythm of the land itself. The same patience, the same endurance, the same hope. Tomorrow will come, as it always has. The bell will ring. The fields will call. And in the hush between dawn and daylight, a world will stir that never truly sleeps. So let the story rest here in the stillness of twilight. The fires burn low. The air is soft with evening. And somewhere, far down the pilgrim's road, the first stars are rising over the quiet earth. Sleep well, traveler. You have walked far enough for tonight.